subject not complying, it's difficult. So just like with the Unit 1 review, I suggest you start with the CED, but before we get to that, I wanted to just really give you guys some general feedback. This was a very common thing looking at the SAQs from the test. There were some very common mistakes that were made throughout all the classes, really. Not to say every individual, but every class had quite a few people that just didn't really respond in the right way to begin with. So I just want to give you a few notes on how you need to respond to these SAQs. Your response to an SAQ should make sense entirely on its own. In other words, you shouldn't need the question there for the statement to make sense. So when you're answering the question, you're not just answering the question, you are making a claim and supporting a claim. So that claim should be standalone and not have anything implied in it. In other words, you can't just say it is this, because that's not a standalone sentence. You need the question for it to make sense. That's part of the reason why it needs to be in complete sentences, okay? Because it's what they're trying to get you to understand is you are making a claim as a historian. You are not just answering a question. Remember that more often than not, you're making some sort of an argument, even in the SAQs. And that's an AP historical thinking skill that involves all of these parts. And I've highlighted the different ones, the different parts of that answer specifically to draw your attention to them. So remember, the first thing you are doing is responding to that prompt or that question. You're going to respond to it with a historically defensible claim that is supported by specific evidence and where that specific evidence is intentionally connected to your claim. What do I mean by intentionally connected? What I mean is that you are specifically saying how that evidence supports what you're saying. You know, you could do that very directly by saying, this evidence supports what I'm saying because of this, but you also could just explain how the evidence actually changed something or how the evidence kept something the same, depending on what kind of question you're answering, or anything along those lines, but you need to not just make it a list of facts, okay? A list of facts is not going to cut it. You need to have all of these parts. You also need to include some sort of context. This goes back to that point about not needing the question to make the answer make sense. Your response has to make sense completely on its own. So you need stuff like time context and place context to further that agenda. Okay, so the idea here is that you should put which time frame. So if the question said, explain X between 1200 and 1450, your answer should either say yada 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 between 1200 and 1450, or you could put the post-classical period, or you could put any type of other designation, but you need some sort of time context. You also need place context, okay? So if you're talking about really anything in this class, it's going to be discussing specific people in specific places. So you should mention what those places are. It could be as specific as a city or an empire, or you could talk about the AP world regions. But if the question is about Afro-Eurasia, don't just put Afro-Eurasia. That's almost the entire world at this point in time. So that doesn't tell us much. That's too vague, okay? And so my overall advice to you is that the information you provide should be as specific and as detailed as possible, but only as far as you can be correct. So don't make things up, because that's not going to help your answer at all, but as detailed as you possibly can be. And your SAQ responses should usually be about 2 to 3 sentences in length. Sometimes one sentence will cut it. Sometimes you'll go a little bit longer. You might have a 4 or 5 sentence response. But most of the time, 2 to 3 sentences is where you're at. Some of you, I told you to kind of tone down the flowery wording because it just wasn't necessary. All right, so that's what I mean about the longer end. Okay, remember, you're trying to not only answer a question, you're also trying to, or at least you should be trying to, keep in mind the grader, okay? Because the easier you can make their job, the better. Think about it. Like, just logically think about it. You want the grader to like you. I'm not saying that there's bias. I'm not saying that they would punish anyone or anything like that. They wouldn't. But at the same time, just logically, wouldn't you want the grader to have the highest opinion of you possible? And that's not going to be done by writing 3 sentences that weren't necessary either. So when you're taking notes, which hopefully you are today, or studying for the AP test, you should always keep the themes in mind because they help you organize your thoughts around kind of the main threads of human history. Throughout any of the review slides you'll see from me, you'll see this table over here. Actually, let me get my laser pointer up. That's cool. So you'll see this table over here, which actually tells you which theme we're in. And I'm putting both the spiced tea version and the AP version because I don't know which one you use. So I want to give you both, okay? And I just thought that was a pretty funny little symbol to use here as well. There's some detail about the themes. I'm not going to go through them now. We don't have the time for it. So this here is this spiced tea chart that I made for Unit 2. If you've been doing your asynchronous work, this should look familiar because this was also done in Unit 1. I'll post these separately because I actually think just standalone they're pretty good kind of review tools. What I mean by that is I could see you using these just to review generally. So going down the list, do I know that? Do I know that? Do I know that? And initially I actually planned on making this an activity for you guys, but what I wanted to do this week, and the reason we don't have any homework this week, or we're not going to be doing anything along those lines, is because I really want you guys to just be free to actually study this week instead of feeling like you've got multiple things stacked on top of you. Okay, this is the assessment week, so you should just be doing your review, catching up if you need to in places, but I wanted it to be that kind of week for you to take a breath as you prepare for the test. Okay, so that's what we'll be using as the basis of this. So the first thing we were doing, by the way, I'll just go back real quick. So anywhere you see highlighted, we're going to be talking about that next, and that's my format throughout this entire thing. So first we're going to learn where Kashgar and Samarkand are, and later on we're going to learn a little bit more about what they were, but they are Silk Road cities, and you can see them right up here, okay? This is some of the graphics I use are from Freemanpedia, so you might have seen these slides already, but where I think he's produced the best option, I'm going to use it, right? So up here is what we're talking about. These are the cities. So Kashgar is going to be really the westernmost city of China at this time and through now. Now this is still in kind of a disputed zone. We're getting into Central Asia there, really. And then Samarkand is in Uzbekistan today, but that's really getting into Central Asia proper. Okay, so those are the two cities from the Silk Road trade routes that they recommend you know. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know Beijing or Hangzhou or Baghdad. You should know, but honestly, these you should probably know already, okay? And this you should probably just know as a citizen of the world, and we're going to talk more about this. So, the next places we're talking about are the Swahili city-states. The Swahili city-states are the eastern coast of Africa along the Indian Ocean. All right, so I'm trying to make sure I'm paying attention to time because I don't want us to fall too far behind either there. So cool. So these are the city-states we're talking about over here. Like I said, east coast of Africa. So everything from Sofala, which is covered right now, Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, Mogadishu. Okay, all of these are important cities for you to know, and this shows you where they're positioned and how they were how they interacted with these other cities of South and Southeast Asia and really Southwest Asia as well. Next, we're talking about some specific kingdoms or empires in South or Southeast Asia. You'll see I used the map from Unit 1 actually because I thought it was the best version of this. But this right here is showing you where the Rajput Gujarat kingdom is, right here, West India. And then the Sultanate of Malacca is down here. At this point, it's showing it in the Sri Vijaya kingdom, but it also, that is a Hindu-Buddhist state, whereas the Sultanate of Malacca, which we'll talk about later, is a Muslim state. Okay, and this is really strategically important because you should by now, when I say the Strait of Malacca, that should mean something to you, because what happened is ships come through here, and then to get to China, there's land in the way, but what they do is they come up through here, and there's a waterway that lets them through. This channel, I must not be viable for ships. It's probably too shallow, whereas this one is not. And lastly, a couple locations to know from the Mongol Empire being Khanbaliq and then the Russian principalities. So Khanbaliq is Beijing, is Khanbaliq. Khanbaliq just means the city of the Khan. But Beijing is what that would become, and obviously Beijing through now is still a pretty important city, I guess you would say. All right, so that was important during the Mongol time, which we'll talk about later, as were these Russian principalities being Kiev and Moscow out here in Russia. Okay, so those are locations that you need to know. The reason I put this up front is because as we go through these topics, we're going to talk about places, and I just want us to have the foundation of knowing where they are. So that's why I put that stuff up front. Excuse me, just having a drink so I don't lose my voice too much. So what we're going to do now is go through the topics, and I'm not going to go through the information on the topic pages, but I've included it throughout so you have it to look at or to refer to as you might want to. But remember, everything that's on these Spice Tea charts is on the topic pages, okay? So what you just saw highlighted on that last chart is all the information from here. So we already went through the location of these cities, and I'll show you a little bit more about them in a second, but then we're going to go through down here some of the financial innovations that were talked about, and then there's also the luxury goods that are mentioned here. I won't do this for every page just in the interest of time, but I'm showing you how this works. I'm showing you what the point is here, so when you're hopefully going through this on your own later, it makes a little bit more sense. So again, the highlighted areas over here are what's pulled from topic 2.1, and I have things kind of grayed out as we've already covered them. So this gives you a brief history of the Silk Roads, which should be kind of review to you because we certainly went through this in World 1 no matter which teacher you had. But the kind of key takeaways or highlights are this, that the Han Dynasty is really responsible for formalizing the Silk Roads. They did that around 130 BCE, but remember, excuse me, at least on the western end of this, they're really just connecting into the Persian royal road system, which was older, which was created under the old Persian Empire under Cyrus and Darius. So this is the eastern connection point, or the eastern spread of that, which existed kind of informally, and there was some trade that was happening informally, but the Han Dynasty is the one that really kind of formalizes that. They're also, important in terms of things like the civil service examination and stuff like that, other cultural things. So after they collapsed and after the Roman Empire collapsed, we call that the collapse of the classical civilizations. When you think of classical period, you're thinking Roman Empire and you're thinking Han Dynasty. The use of the Silk Roads declined. That's because everything was chaotic at this point, okay? It wasn't necessarily safe to use these routes. They weren't being maintained, they were being guarded, no one was in charge necessarily, or different people were in charge. So their use declined, okay? It also wasn't as much of a prosperous period for any of the, not any, but at least the eastern end civilizations. It wasn't as prosperous during this time for them. They end up getting reinvigorated by the strong trading empires that started emerging during the post-classical period. So that's the period we're talking in now. Okay, post-classical really means like basically 500 to 1500-ish. And we're obviously well within that period here. So we're talking about people like the Abbasids and the Tang Dynasty. In China, that growth then continues under the Song Dynasty, who used improved commercial and financial practices to grow trade. And then also, as we learned in our Unit 1 review, their population also boomed due to Champa rice. So they had more people, and so there was more trade driven, not just by population and more production, but also by the methods of trading improving as well. The Song get conquered by the Mongol Empire that then conquers most of the full distance of the Silk Roads between 1206 and 1279. They're a short-lived empire, but very important, as we're going to learn about. And when they were in charge, they improved the infrastructure. So they improved the roads, they made them better, they protected them. They also, caravanserai were spreading during this time, so that would have spread as well. And there were other things too, like the YAM system, that communications system that would have made use of these same networks. So not only did it provide incentive to upkeep them and improve them, but also more reason to protect them. So all of these things start feeding off of each other, and communication and trade starts growing. The stability is a big part of the reason that became safer. Okay, so as you have the Pax Mongolica, as you have Dar al-Islam really bringing peace to the kind of eastern side or the western side of the equation, you have just trade becoming safer because there's just less. There are fewer nefarious characters acting, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So as it becomes safer, it increases. And like I said, as those routes become safer and better to use, people start using them for other reasons than just trading. Okay, you have the YAM system communications going on, you have military reasons, diplomacy, religious missionaries, and then eventually just curious people start traveling. They start traveling between regions, and we call that interregional travel. So anything that's happening between multiple regions is interregional. Things that are happening within one region is intra-regional. And that's a little counterintuitive. If you saw the word inter, you might think it's inside of a region. That's not true. Inter means between. Think of like intermediary. That's an intermediary that acts between two things. That's a good source for that route. So this is a slightly more detailed version of that map I showed you to start the discussion of the Silk Road. And the first thing I want to say is it's a mess. Look at it. It's got all kinds of stuff on it. It's almost hard to even understand what the point of this is. And that's kind of the point. What I mean by that is the world started becoming more complex. And I've said this a few times, and hopefully, last year I made my goal to make sure that all my students by the end, or as many as possible by the end, understood what Eurocentrism means. Understood that we are living in a world that has not a world, but a country that has a strong bias toward all things European, right? This year, what I would say is what my goal is by the end of this year, I hope all of you understand that the story of humans is the story of increasing complexity. And that's all that you see here, okay? As we start interacting with each other more, everything starts getting more complicated and more complex. So this map shows you how goods and culture traveled along the roads. Here's some feedback about Samarkand from Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, who we'll learn about. They had some nice things to say about it. Kashgar, like I said, is one of the westernmost Chinese cities, and it continues to be a source of conflict even through this day. Not the city, but that region is what I'm talking about. Up here you see some of the things that spread, some of the technology that spreads over this same time. Over here you'll see the religions that spread, as you see the different symbols being for the Eightfold Path. This symbol represents Islam, and this symbol represents Hinduism. Eightfold Path is obviously Buddhist. And then this chart down here gives you some kind of some insight into what's going on. But the point here is you have some cities that start declining because there's more invasions going on. There's more kind of conflict going on. You also had disease that starts spreading. You had a decline in agriculture due to a couple reasons. Okay, not just because conflict makes farming dangerous and difficult. You also had a little ice age during this time, so the ability to farm inherently declined. But you also had growing populations putting pressure on the agricultural system. And so that system then starts treating the land pretty poorly, and so you start having the land declining because of agriculture. So you have lots of things involved here. You have land being intentionally destroyed by war. You have land intentionally being destroyed accidentally by bad farming practices. Those farming practices are spreading because there's more people, and at the same time the sun's not doing its part, so we can't grow food as well anyway. That being said, you have some cities start benefiting from this. You have some invasions start slowing down during this period. Like I said, once power starts getting consolidated into a few large empires, you have transportation start improving. Toward the end of the period, that little ice age is over, so the climate becomes more suitable or more favorable to growing food. And then the other part to mention too, we talked about this in the Unit 1 review, is that as the bubonic plague spread, that really reorganized labor, the power structures in labor. And so you had that change quite a bit as well. So the thing to understand is that innovation is what's driving a lot of this change and a lot of this development that's going on now. These include things, by the way, anytime you see a pink word, that means I almost said SOL. Wow, I'm so tied to last year. That means it's an AP exam thing. That means it's something that's on that SPICE T chart, which if it's on the SPICE T chart, it's in the curriculum. So anyway, they improved infrastructure like caravanserai. Those were the inns that existed about 100 miles apart. It was about the distance a camel could travel in a day. If you think about it, that makes sense because that was as far as the people could travel in a day. And so that made travel quite a bit more safe because before this point, sometimes people would just camp out alongside the road at night, and that made them vulnerable to attack when they were sleeping and stuff like that. So having these inns made it not only more enjoyable to travel, but also safer. All right? So that causes trade to increase. As trade starts increasing, governments and people start thinking about ways to also improve the kind of financial transactions that are going on. So we have financial innovations, like, first of all, the use of money inherently, we call them money economies, an economy based on money. If you think about it, imagine every time you went to the grocery store, you had to bring a bunch of your stuff and negotiate with the cashier about what you were going to trade for your groceries. All right? Wouldn't really work, let's face it, right? So societies embrace money economies because they improve the efficiency or the performance of the economic system overall. It becomes easier to trade with each other if you have money as a store of value, so you don't need to do that bartering part, okay? So that gives rise to the idea of systems of credit, things like flying cash, which was an early version of paper money, that basically allow value to be stored in something other than a product, right? That's the whole point here. You're getting credit for assumed wealth or value that exists. It exists within real products at this point, for sure, but it's being represented by something else. In this case, now early paper money starts forming. So that it lets those merchants store and exchange their wealth. They needed to exchange this wealth in places that were called banking houses. And this is really the start of the modern banking industry. It really is. Okay, these early banking houses are the first banks, okay, and they really exist to really just handle those deposits and withdrawals. And they need to happen in multiple places, so there needs to be standardization and there needs to be communication between them. And so you have banking starts developing as a thing. Merchants used what were called bills of exchange to prove that they had made their deposits. So rather than carrying the money with them, which had the paper money, which had its value directly tied to it being a form of credit or a form of value, you had the bills of exchange represent the fact that you had made deposits in one place, so you could make withdrawals in another. Okay, these are the first ATMs, basically, but they exist. You guys might even know what ATM means, but they were the first place you could go get money. All right, in a different location than where you had put it in the first place. Those were at the banking houses, but this was done via the bills of exchange. And if you think about it, that would change trade a lot, because now you could access your wealth from other places. You didn't need to be near it, so you could travel further. Before this point, it was hard to, because you would only be able to trade what you had, going back to bartering. So you need to understand that as trade and travel expanded, particularly in the West, demand for luxury goods increased. This increase was due to a couple of reasons. One was because the Crusaders were coming back from the Holy Lands and talking about the East, which I'm putting in quotation marks in my hand because of the clearly kind of generalizing racist undertones of it. Okay, it's not a good thing to say, but it's the way that they would have referred to it at the time. So that's why I'm pointing it out. So as they came back and as traders were coming from afar, people start becoming more and more interested in kind of what they have. What are the items they have that we don't have? How can we get those things? That includes luxury goods like textiles and porcelains, and you need to know that those came from the East, primarily from China, India, and Persia. Those were the regions that were making a lot of textiles and porcelains like you see there on the right. This is actually from the Song Dynasty. They were making these and exporting them to European and African markets. There was also increased demand for metal, and so Chinese iron and metal production increased. And you also need to understand that the methods for making it, sorry, excuse me, I'm really having a lot of hiccups. The methods for making those things also improved. Other Chinese goods like gunpowder and paper spread, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically Chinese innovations start spreading to the world, and luxury goods from China, India, and Persia start spreading as well. Lastly, you should just know about improved navigational technologies like the astrolabe, which was an Islamic invention. The astrolabe basically goes from west to east. That travels, and west to west, but it travels from the Middle East to Europe, but also throughout Asia and Africa. And the compass, which was a Chinese invention, which then travels from east to west. All of this starts spreading along the Silk Roads. And so it has this multiplier effect where not only is the technology being developed because people are trading, but now more people can trade because the technology exists. So you can see how this kind of virtuous cycle starts and kind of gets going. So here are the topic pages for the Mongol Empire and the making of the modern world. Again, that's all summarized here on the Spice Tea chart. Okay, these are the important takeaways from this time. So here's a map that roughly shows you how the Mongol Empire sat. Okay, this is still when it would have been the sole, the one empire. It eventually does break into four, and we'll talk about that. Actually, well, it's kind of a little bit of both because it does show that that's the full extent of their rule. So it was after that period, but really by the names, like the Khanate of the Great Khan, this was a term from when it was still one empire. That'll make more sense in a second. But this shows how they're positioned and how much of the world they controlled, okay? So at the time that they controlled it, they had they had the largest connected land empire that's ever existed, still to this day. This GIF over here shows you how that grew and also how quickly it grew. Okay, we're talking about one human lifetime. They go from that, not much, northern China, just annoying China a little bit, north of China, to spreading out all the way to Europe and the Middle East and into southeastern Europe. So they start, though, as just nomadic pastoralists. That means they kind of had cattle that they kept. But they end up building an empire through a few different means, but one that you need to understand is their horseback archery. Okay, they were excellent at fighting on horseback, and that made them a type of adversary that most of Europe had not seen before. They're first mentioned in the 8th century by China's Tang Dynasty, and like I said, for a brief moment, they controlled most of the known world at that time, known by Afro-Eurasians. So as they conquered, you need to understand that they did this pretty brutally. Okay, they destroyed cities, they burned the countryside. There was a reputation of them being just these brutal, destroying machines, basically, and that was partially earned. Okay, they were pretty ruthless. But here's the other side of that. Once they controlled people, which, by the way, a lot of people just gave up. So a lot of groups never actually saw that brutal side because they didn't fight back. But for those that were conquered or for those that chose to not fight back, once the Mongols were in control, they were pretty tolerant. They generally left the people in charge that were in charge. They let them keep their local norms as best they could. They didn't make anyone change religions. For the most part, early on, the Mongols just kept their own religion and said, you do you, we're going to do us. Later on, the Mongols end up starting to convert to the religions of the people that they conquer. And that's really a big part of why they disintegrate, is because eventually they kind of just merge into the cultures that they controlled and kind of become part of it. And so eventually they kind of almost merge into nothingness. But, we call that syncretism. We call that merging into a new thing, syncretism. So this goes through a timeline of how that happened. Okay, if you had me last year, some of these things probably look familiar, but I have tweaked things a bit to make them a little bit more detailed and a little bit more AP-centric. But this shows you how quickly it goes from Genghis Khan being born to the empire basically not existing in the course of 200 years. I say 160 because we had to give Genghis Khan time to grow up and stuff. But the point is they go from nothing to controlling most of the world in about 160 years, most of the known world. So the most well-known person you need to know is Temujin, or as you probably know his name, Genghis Khan. That was really a title, not a name. So he's born in 1162. His first conquest was actually of a rival Mongol clan that kidnapped his wife. He got her back, so that was good for him. In 1206, he gets selected to become the leader of all of the Mongol clans and becomes Genghis Khan. All right, he's the first Khagan, which just means Great Khan, means kind of the supreme leader, basically, of the Mongol Empire. He was unique in his leadership style because he rewarded people for their abilities and merit, not their family ties. This was a different way of doing things to other leaders. He didn't care if you were from noble birth. If you were worthless, he didn't care. You can see there, he killed a lot of people, okay? And again, this was their conquest. The real takeaway, though, more important than the number, you should look at the years, right? Because later on, it becomes easier to kill lots of people, and that's mostly because there are a lot more people. Genghis Khan killed a lot of people before there were a lot of people, so that made him feared, okay? That's why the Mongols had this reputation, is because, like I said, they were pretty ruthless, but the other side, they were pretty tolerant. He died in 1227, and his empire ends up getting split into four, each led by a son or grandson. Mostly sons, but one of his sons died before he did. So then the northwesternmost the Khan of the Golden Horde ends up being controlled by grandsons. So this shows you how that split initially happens. That's what I was talking about on the earlier slide about these being the older Khanates, okay? But it gets split into the four. And the Khanate of the Great Khan, which was the easternmost one, which controlled Mongolia, China, and Korea, that is the main Khanate, okay? And the person who's in charge of that is still the Kagan. All right, there were 5 Kagans, but really there's only 4. Okay, the last one was Mongi Khan, and he dies in 1259. I want to point out how quick this was. Let's go back. Genghis Khan died 1277. Between then and 1259, there were 2 people that were in charge that are already dead. By 1259, the 4th of these great leaders dies, and when that happens, a period of civil war ensues. And after that point, really these four Khanates basically become their own empires. They become separate empires with one controlling East Asia, one controlling kind of Central Asia, one controlling the Middle East, and one controlling what I would say is North Central Asia and getting into Russia and Europe, actually. This division, though, you need to understand, weakens them. A big part of the Mongol strength was the fact that they controlled everything. So this weakening of them eventually leads to their collapse, which you could say was fully complete by 1368. So very short-lived, but very powerful. Like I said, the northwesternmost of the Khanates was the Khanate of the Golden Horde. That ends up getting split and ultimately gets controlled by 2 grandsons. This is really mostly what we're talking about here is Kazakhstan and parts of Russia, really the populated parts of modern-day Russia. But they actually reached all the way into Europe, okay, and they conquered as far in as Hungary, and they invaded as far in as Austria and Poland. Now this, like I said, becomes one of those 4 Khanates, or one of those 4 empires that emerges after that civil war, after Mongi Khan dies. And eventually this Khanate itself gets split up into multiple parts. So this gets further divided, there's further decentralization, and then by the 16th century they get defeated by the Russians, who end that time. So like I said, 1368 is when we say the Mongol Empire ends, because the Khanate of the Khanate of the Great Khan, or the Yuan Dynasty, whatever you want to call it, that ends, but the other parts of it still do go on as long as we're talking now the 16th century. You need to know about Kublai Khan. He was the 5th of the Khagans, but like I said, really only the first 4 were really in charge. So he's only in charge of the Khanate of the Great Khan, or the Yuan Dynasty. Okay, remember that's the Mongol dynasty in China. He also invades Korea in 1260. Okay, so he actually does that and takes over Korea before he takes over all of China. So 1260, he takes over pretty much all of Korea. By 1279, he's taken over all of China. Okay, so he fully defeats the Song Dynasty by then. But you need to understand they were mostly defeated by then, either words. And then that's when the Yuan Dynasty is created. He's their first empire. That's when they established Khanbaliq, which I mentioned before, the city of the Khan that becomes Beijing eventually. So you need to know that, because this is a major world event. Okay, this is the start of Beijing as an important city. And like I said before, Beijing's pretty important today. He also tried to invade Vietnam and Japan, but wasn't successful. In fact, when they invaded Japan, the fleet was destroyed by some weather. And so Japan, if not for that weather, Japan might have also been conquered by the Mongols, and you would have had a much different Japanese history had that happened. So you need to understand this idea of the Pax Mongolica, all right? You might remember the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Well, this is the Mongolian peace. And the idea is that by controlling such a large swath of land, they brought a great deal of stability to that land, okay? And so that allowed for a time of prosperity, as people weren't so worried about being invaded or killed or starving or whatever. They were able to just be productive and expand trade networks and expand industry and create new jobs and all of that good stuff. I mentioned before that they created the YAM. That was a big communication system. You do want to understand that they increased communications kind of generally. So that's trade and communications are the 2 things that they're really associated with, at least on the positive side, and then kind of death and destruction on the other, of course. Last thing to understand is all of that control wasn't without consequence. So because people could travel along the Silk Roads easily, they did, and that meant they also brought some bad things with them, like the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which devastated the Mongol Empire and also then has significant implications not just for the rest of Asia, but also for Europe, kind of most famously. So you need to know these major Mongol accomplishments, the first of all being the adoption of Uyghur script. This was the first written Mongol language in 1208. And it's significant because it allowed the Mongol, it was part of what allowed the Mongol Empire to become as successful as it was. All right, it's hard to imagine them becoming this powerful interregional vast empire without some way of writing things down. Okay, if everything was being done by word, that would be difficult. As they spread, you need to understand that culture and military technology diffused along their conquering path. Okay, in other words, as they spread their technology, but they also spread technologies that they had adopted from the people they conquered. Okay, they took gunpowder from China and used that gunpowder to conquer other places, and then other places saw that gunpowder and they wanted it too. It's as simple as that. They also use siege weaponry, in other words, things like catapults and battering rams and stuff like that, to be able to take down city walls. Remember, these are guys on horseback. All right, they were not equipped to take down cities, but yet they did because they adopted siege weaponry from those that they conquered. They spread Greek and Islamic medical knowledge as they spread as well. So basically, the Muslim world, remember, safekeepers of that Greco-Roman knowledge. In other words, they, not just philosophy, but also scientific knowledge, they really embraced. And so they had vast libraries where they kept that knowledge and then they expanded on that knowledge. And so the Mongols, as they conquered, brought some of that knowledge, which some of it started in Europe, ended up bringing it back to Europe. They also bring numbering systems like Arabic numerals, which are actually Indian numerals. They introduced those to Europe as well. So numbering begins for Europe, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty big deal, okay? And lastly, you need to understand that they had a centralized government, as we talked about, that becomes decentralized. But they also used a single legal system. And that, just like the banking houses become the kind of foundational element of the modern banking system, the Mongol legal system, like others we've talked about mostly through World War I, become one of the models for modern legal systems to emerge. So now we'll talk about 2.3, just like the others. These pages you might want to look at as you're studying, but all of the information you need from them is really tied up in these in the highlighted areas of the SPICE T-chart. By the way, don't take that to mean that I don't think that the stuff in the CED is important. You should review all this stuff. I'm just, in the interest of time, not going to, because I want to get through all this stuff. All right, so let me, so these are the kind of pertinent areas for unit or topic 2.3. I see a question pop up. I'll do questions at the end, so I'll answer questions at the end. So just like I did a brief history of Silk Road trade, here's a brief history of Indian Ocean trade. So, sea trade has been around for a while, even in the Indian Ocean. Longer distances start becoming popular around the 7th century, and it's around that same time that you see major cities, or not major cities, trading settlements start forming around that time, and then some of those settlements become major cities. That's what I was trying to say. Maritime, which just means sea-based trade, was less vulnerable to attack than land routes. It was also less vulnerable to the interference of governments and taxation, at least at the start, than the land routes were. Also, generally, they could transport bigger cargoes because the ship can handle more than a camel can, basically. It also doesn't need to be fed. So, like, if you want to carry a large cargo of camels, with camels, you're going to need lots of camels, which will need lots of food and support. New technologies, like we talked about the astrolabe and the compass, but also things like just building bigger ships and also lateen or triangular sails, allowed those distances to become further. Again, we're talking about inter-regional trade, travel rather, and trade. But that's trade and travel between different regions, not within the same. That would be intra-regional. Also, as we understood monsoon winds better, we were able to use them to improve trade as well. So in other words, you see here, these arrows show some of those monsoon winds. So in part of the year, they're going toward India. Part of the year, they're going away from India. So if you're trying to travel toward India at the time of the year when the wind is blowing against you, you're going to have a hard time than you would if you were going when the winds were with you. So as people understood that, they were able to make travel more predictable and also make travel a lot faster. Like I talked about before, the demand for specialized and luxury products drives a lot of this development, drives a lot of this trade. There's good reason to do it because people want to buy the stuff. So that's where you saw stuff like textiles and porcelains. But also from here you have spices and fruit. From Southeast Asia, we have down here the Spice Islands, which are named because, I mean, it's not really a name for them, I shouldn't say, but that's what they're, yeah, it's one of the names for them. They're so named because you have spices that come from them. You had pepper coming from India and Sri Lanka. You also have fruit, mostly citrus fruit, coming from this region. Eventually, some of the Southeast Asian states start developing navies to actually regulate the trade, mostly to tax it. Malacca is an example of this, and also to protect that trade. Okay, just like how once the Mongols could protect Silk Road trade, that improves things, as you might imagine. If you can limit things like piracy and all that, that benefits Indian Ocean trade as well. So here's the Freemanpedia map for that. Okay, so this shows you some of the travels not only of people, okay, but also some diaspora communities, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and then, as we're talking about trade mostly, some of the main goods that flowed out of Africa into Asia and South and Southeast Asia, but also some of the goods that flow from here to there. So you need to understand that states grow as trade goes, okay? So as there's more trade, there's more people. As there's more people, there's more need for government, and so there's more government. Along the east coast of Africa, that's the Swahili coast. That's where you had those city-states that we talked about before, okay? Places like Sofala, Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, and Mogadishu. Okay, those are ones you should know, so they're along here. In kind of western India, that's where you had the Rajput Sultanate of Gujarat. They were Muslim. They're over here in western India. Okay, there's not, you don't see them on here, but if I go back, you'll see them here. That's the G up here. Okay. So again, we're talking about in here. In Southeast Asia, here in Malacca, you have the Sultanate of Malacca, which was also Muslim. Okay, but they were of Malay descent. They start around 1400, and they have control over the Strait of Malacca, which gives them very important strategic control of trade, mostly from China to the rest of the world via the Indian Ocean. Now remember, China did have the Silk Roads as well, so it wasn't the only option, but trade does start going through here, and at different times becomes more and more important. The bottom line, you should also know too that there are some important port cities like Hangzhou, and or Hangzhou, depending on how you want to say it, and also Shanghai, which is up here. You don't see it on the map, but it's kind of north of there. Those becomes important trading cities at this point as well. And the bottom line, what I was trying to say, is that basically wealth and innovation let these powerful states trade over longer distances. And so as those longer distances occur, you start having cultural and technological diffusion with more kind of disparate people, with further and further groups. As that long distance travel happens more and more, some people start settling in places that are not their homeland. We call these diasporic communities, or a diaspora. They form mostly early on in trade cities, okay, and usually where there's large groups of such migrants, you would have kind of large communities form, okay, where you have a large Muslim diaspora, you'll have mosques start being built and stuff like that, so all of those people have a place to go worship. Their presence leads to both cultural and economic exchanges, as well as the exchange of knowledge and technology between disparate or very different groups. Here are some that you need to know. Again, the pink ones are the AP ones. So you need to know that Arab and Persian Muslims start kind of settling down. In West India, that's like, for example, the Gujarat kingdom that I mentioned. They also settle in East Africa along the Swahili coast, as we learned about in Unit 1. A lot of those city-states are actually run by Muslims, and also in through South and Southeast Asia, and even into China as well. They reach into East Asia. Chinese merchants start spreading mostly through South and Southeast Asia, although you do have some communities even as far afield as Africa. And then Malay communities spread. So this is when we're talking about Malay, or nowadays Malaysia, we're talking kind of the northern part, let's say, of Indonesia. But these are, ethnic Malay people. They spread to India. They also spread throughout Southeast Asia up through here, okay? And this map shows you where some of that spread happened, basically. I included the map of this spread specifically because I assume this will be the least familiar to you, okay? Most of you probably understand the spread of Islam by now. And while you may not know where the communities are located, you probably understand, because of Sinification, that there's a Chinese influence beyond China as well. So these two kind of should be more second nature to you, so I wanted to highlight this one. Lastly, you should know that Jewish communities also emerged along trade routes in India and China. Okay, and those start from about the 12th century. That's not one of the AP ones you need to know, but it is good to know. You need to know about this gentleman, Zheng Ha. There's kind of multiple pronunciations, and I'm sorry for butchering it, but I'm doing kind of the best I can as a non-native speaker. All right, so what you need to understand here is that before and really after really just one of the Ming emperors, it's not even the whole Ming dynasty, but before and after this one specific emperor, China is pretty isolationist. What that means is they're not engaging with the outside world too much, okay? They're mostly keeping to their own affairs and trying to remain self-sufficient. During this brief period of time, from about 1368 to 1433, the Ming dynasty changes that. They build a massive fleet of what they call treasure ships. These are huge ships. All right, the biggest being what are called junk ships. If you look on the left, that compares. The big ship is a Chinese junk ship. Okay, that's going to be built in the early 1400s. The smaller ship is what Columbus came over from Spain into the Americas on. That's about 100 years later, right? Almost 100 years later. So that shows you the scale that China was building. They were building huge ships. These were warships that were going out to, first of all, collect tribute from other states, also just to reassert the dominance of China. Remember, they had just been conquered by the Mongols, so they just beat back the Mongols. Now again, it's an ethnic Chinese group that's in charge of China, and so they want to flex a little bit. They want to let the world know that they're in charge. So that's part of this as well. So between 1405 and 1433, there was a fleet that was sent out on 7 voyages that were led by Zheng Ha. He didn't go on all of the voyages. He actually went on the first one and I think a couple later ones, but he led the fleet that went on all of them. These voyages went as far afield as the Middle East and Africa, so they reach all the way to the Swahili coast. And like I said, the goal here was to increase trade, to let the world know China was a force, okay, and also to have some cultural exchange. That wasn't a primary cause, but it certainly was a result of what went on. But you need to understand, after this happens, they basically scrap that project and go back to being isolationists. They didn't see the point in it. I know we're kind of getting near time, guys, but these get shorter as we go, so hopefully we'll be able to get through it and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So now we'll talk about 1.4, which was, or 2.4, sorry, which was the Trans-Saharan African Trade Network. So this is the important stuff from this topic. So I'll do again just this brief history. So trade had been going on for a while, but you have to understand, we talked about in Unit 1 how you had this geographic barrier being the Sahara Desert. So this is in the way of exchanges between North and South. And this is part of the reason why North Africa is kind of its own culture to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. But as the use of camels and caravans starts, and then as things like caravanserai start popping up to allow the trade to happen, you have an increase in range. In other words, the distance that trade was possible will happen over a longer and longer period. You also have innovations like the camel saddle. Okay, that was a way for camels to carry larger or more cargo, and so that allowed for more stuff to be transferred over these long distances. So those are the two parts. Some technologies is centered around longer distances. Some technologies centered around having more stuff on those trips, and then also there's navigational technologies like we talked about. In West Africa, you need to know the Mali Empire, which we talked about in Unit 1, so hopefully you know who they are. They convert to Islam, and they control the gold and salt trade. Again, when you think West African trade, think gold and salt. Those are the two big things. You should by now know the name Mansa Musa. He's a powerful Malinese king. He was a devout Muslim as well. And he, after going on Hajj and after spreading the fame of the Mali Empire and the wealth of the Mali Empire all the way through to Mecca, he comes back and decides to make Timbuktu an important Islamic center. So he builds mosques, he builds houses of learning, and between his reputation as this devout and wealthy Muslim and the infrastructure he builds in Timbuktu, that attracts a lot of Muslim and Islamic, means the same thing, whatever, scholars to Timbuktu, and that actually increases the profile of the city. It's also an important trading hub. You should know that Mali gets absorbed into the Songhai Kingdom around 1500. We'll learn about them in Unit 3, so I won't get into it too much. But around 1500 they go away. And you should know to their east that you have the Hausa Kingdoms, which were really just city-states. It wasn't one kingdom, but it was a collection. And they benefited a lot from, as you might imagine, you see all these lines, which are the major trade routes. They benefit from that trans-Saharan trade, not just this way, but also east to west. So this map shows you where the Hausa Kingdoms were, where Mali was, and then other groups like the Mamluks in Ethiopia over here, and what some of those major roads were. Next is 2.5. These are the cultural consequences of exchange, or really the cultural consequences of all this human connectivity. So again, here's the stuff you need to know. So this slide here kind of builds on one of the Freeman maps, all right? The central idea is that cross-cultural interactions lead to the diffusion of things like literary traditions, art and culture, and scientific and technological innovations. You also need to understand that religion spreads with trade, or spreads along these trade routes. So again, that's going to be Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Islam's going to spread from Arabia through North Africa into Europe, into Spain, from North Africa into West Africa. It'll extend from Arabia up into the Caucasus region. Okay, that's what we're talking about, really Eastern Russia or Western Russia. And then it's going to spread from Arabia through Persia into Central Asia, and also into South, and then eventually Southeast Asia, not just through land, but also through these sea routes. I'm highlighting it because it's the one that really spreads the most, okay? Other than that, you have Buddhism spreads through East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Hinduism really just through Southeast Asia. So Islam's the one you're really going to want to know. This map also shows you the routes that some of the travelers took, but we're going to talk about them in a second, like Marjorie Kemp, Marco Polo, and probably most importantly, Ibn Battuta. This is just another look at it, and I think it's useful because it shows it's like a step back and just look at, okay, who are the main powers and what are they exchanging? So your main powers at this point are going to be Dar al-Islam, going to be medieval Europe, Byzantine Empire kind of in between the two, and you have the Mongol Empire at one point controlling Imperial China as well, and then Southeast Asia. So this shows you kind of how those exchanges happened and what the main things that were being exchanged in each instance were. I just want to point out that as all these cultures start interacting, they start finding out that things aren't the same in other parts of the world. One big area of kind of consideration is the way that women were treated. Okay, women had more rights in the Mongol Empire and in West Africa, and at times in Japan, and at times in Southeast Asia, than they had certainly in Europe and East Asia and East Africa, okay, so, and the Middle East. So the idea is that as these cultures started bumping into each other, they started to find out that things weren't done the same in other parts of the world as they were there. And then that, as you can imagine, has an impact on cultures for many years to come. So the first of the three travelers you need to know from this time period is Margery Kempe. She was an English Christian mystic. Anytime I say she at this point in time, your ears should perk up because, at this point in time, even though we have those examples of women having more rights, they weren't leading militaries here by and large. Some in the Mongol Empire they did a little bit, but they weren't leading expeditions. They were still pretty stationary. Margery Kempe is an example of one that wasn't. So she traveled to the Holy Lands and through Europe, mostly Italy, to go on basically religious pilgrimages. So she wrote a book, an autobiography that detailed her life and her travels. One of the main events there is when she visited Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Mount Zion, the Jordan River. That's what I mean when I say the Holy Lands. She visited them over 3 weeks before returning back to Italy and then spent years in Europe. So her book is really useful for modern historians because they give insight into the world of medieval European women. She was exceptional, yes, so her life may have not been exactly normal, but it's one of the only written accounts that exists. So even though it might have been a little bit exceptional, we don't have much else to pull on other than what we can assume and what we can extrapolate from the fact that there aren't the stories in the first place, right? So think about it. You should know that she's venerated by the Church of England, but not actually by the Catholic Church. Now we'll talk about Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo. This actually has, this map is useful. I really like this map. It's from Time magazine, but also shows some of the voyages of Zheng Han, kind of how he reached, like I said, all the way as far as Eastern Africa or Swahili coast. But if you're looking at the lines on here, blue is Marco Polo, which is impressive, don't get me wrong. He goes from Venice all the way to Hangzhou. Okay, so he went pretty far. But if we're talking about who traveled, there's really no one more than Ibn Battuta. So he traveled, the numbers range. Sometimes you'll see 117,000 kilometers times rounding it up to 120. I think that equals 73,000 miles. But yeah, so this just shows you how vast his travels were. Now he mostly travels within Dar al-Islam. Okay, he was Muslim himself. He mostly travels in the Muslim world, but he does step outside. I mean, this was Muslim world by then, but it's kind of transitioning through that. Same thing with the Caucasus region, but then in through East Asia for sure, he's not necessarily dealing with Muslim powers, and through South and Southeast Asia, there would be varying degrees of that. So these are two people you need to know. Marco Polo, I'll talk about first. He was from Venice. He was a merchant that traveled, like I said, there as far as China. He spent 17 years working for Kublai Khan during his travels. So he, wrote a lot about the Mongol Yuan dynasty and his time there. So he writes this book about his travels. It becomes a bestseller in Europe. And so this is one of those points of evidence, like the Crusades, that increases European interest in the East generally. And so that leads to future exploration. You can draw a very direct line from Marco Polo to Columbus even, because it gave Europeans an interest in the outside world that they just didn't have. Because remember, we're talking about the late medieval period, but it wasn't a great period in Western Europe. So they're just coming out of it and now starting to become interested in distant people and distant goods. Ibn Battuta is next to know. He was a Muslim from Morocco. Like I said, he travels a huge distance over 44 years, takes them all the way from Spain and Mali to China. He wrote a book, which I had to put the name of because the name is awesome. A gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of traveling. So he dictated that book. He didn't write it, but he dictated it to someone else who wrote it on his behalf. And that book has provided huge insight, just like Margery Kempe's book provides insight into women at the time. His book just provides insight into the world at the time. A lot of what we know, we verify through his eyes, through his knowledge. In terms of the environmental consequences of human connectivity or human networks, you can see it's not a very long list. We covered most of what it is. But basically, the bottom line here is as people spread, they brought stuff with them. That stuff was fruit, so things like bananas, and also things like sugar that they brought from Southeast Asia through all the way to Africa. They also brought citrus fruits to the Mediterranean basin. Again, anything you see in pink is an AP thing, so it's in pink for a reason. So that citrus fruit also made its way to India on the way through. We've talked about champa rice and how that influenced China. So that comes from Vietnam up to China. So champa rice changes China, makes the song population boom. And so once the population booms, so does trade, so does innovation. But it also means they take disease with them. Things like the bubonic plague or Black Death, which changes not only Asia, but significantly changes Europe. You could argue that the bubonic plague is the reason that feudalism ended. And if it wasn't the reason, it was certainly one of them. You need to understand that as these crops move and as, like I said earlier, agricultural practices grow and expand, this changes the environment, sometimes for the worse. Sometimes it's deforestation. Sometimes it's nutrient deficiencies in the soil from over farming. So it has a huge impact on the environment. You also need to understand that as the human populations grow and as they need more food, they also change the environment. They take up physical space and they also impact the environment, like I said, through farming and through the need for more food. And then also you need to just understand that the Black Death changed human history, okay? It changes Europe, it changes Asia, and it also is the first kind of global instance of a pandemic spreading that gives us more of that idea of the potential for global disease to spread. So that's it for the review of that. So now let's talk about key concepts. Now this is partially you've done this, okay? So the learning objective here, the main learning objective for the review unit is just this: to be able to explain similarities and differences among the networks of exchange that existed between 1200 and 1450. So here I've listed some some similarities. One being that innovation caused increased exchange. You should understand that those innovations occur in those three main areas: commercial innovations, things like caravanserai and bigger ships; technological innovations, things like the navigational technologies that emerge, and also products that emerge; and then financial innovations, things like forms of credit, bills of exchange, that kind of stuff. You need to understand that stability between Pax Mongolica and the stability that Dar al-Islam brought by controlling basically these two, controlling all of the trading world or almost all of the trading world, allowed more trade to occur. And you need to know that all of these things spread as people did. Some differences I've just really listed, kind of they were structured. So Silk Roads and Trans-Saharan were land-based. Indian Ocean was maritime-based. Silk Roads and Indian Ocean were inter-regional, whereas Trans-Saharan was more intra-regional. It connected it to other regions, but the Sahara Desert is in Africa. You could say it's two regions, being like three regions, West, North, and East Africa, but it's more intra-regional than the others, that's for sure. And you need to understand that these diaspora communities spread mostly along the Indian Ocean. There were fewer diaspora communities that spread over the land-based empires, but there still would be some Muslim diaspora communities that would spread over land-based, and most of the Jewish ones that spread also spread over land.